Okay. I'll send out the link for people who left to a past recording for you guys if we missed that first bit, but that first bit was mainly review from last time. So we're talking about the hypothalamus. We have this tropic hormone coming from the hypothalamus. We know it's tropic in this map because it is affecting a second hormone from the anterior pituitary. So most of these anterior pituitary hormones are also tropic hormones. These tropic hormones often are going to be going out to endocrine glands out in the rest of the body, so not in the head anymore, secreting another hormone. Generally, the hormone coming from an endocrine gland out in the rest of the body is not a tropic hormone. Its main job is going to be going to a target cell, telling target cells what to do. We can see on this map that we also have some negative feedback loops. So what we're seeing in this first negative feedback loop, the shorter one, we literally refer to as like a short loop negative feedback. So that's when presence of this hormone coming from the anterior pituitary is looping right back to the hypothalamus and turning off that signal. It doesn't have very far to go. Those two structures are really close to each other, both on this map and in physical space. So that's why we call this short loop. Long loop negative feedback is when we have our hormone coming further down in the chain, looping all the way back up to the hypothalamus and turning off that hypothalamic signal kind of from the end of this process. Okay, so it would take longer in physical space, but we can also see on our like little flow chart, we're skipping this intermediary step. We're talking about the fact that we're going all the way back to the hypothalamus. So that's our long loop negative feedback. Actually, to take a quick look at this diagram before class today, because you can see there are an awful lot of hormones coming from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So we're going to look at some general kind of trends within these hormones, as well as focus on some of them specifically over the rest of this unit. So here we have our key to all the abbreviations that I added to the bottom. So we're thinking about all of these as being part of this connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So in purple up top here, we have our hypothalamic hormones. So those tropic hormones that are all affecting the release of some anterior pituitary hormone. So we can see that some of these effects are sort of excitatory, right? So some of these are increasing the release of a hormone, and some of them are inhibitory, right? So some of them are stopping you from releasing that hormone, okay? Pointing this out because this gives us some really common naming systems for hormones coming from the hypothalamus that are part of these hypothalamic pituitary axes. Okay. So here we can see that all of these hypothalamic hormones tend to end in RH or IH, right? So here we have our prolactin releasing hormone. That's what the RH is for. Prolactin is the P, releasing is the R, H is hormone. Okay. We can see that that prolactin releasing hormone tells your anterior pituitary to release prolactin, which has an effect on lactation in the breast. We can see that prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is another form of dopamine, is also affecting that same hormone, that same prolactin, but this time we're stopping production. That's what the inhibiting hormone part is about. So if you're trying to guess whether a hormone is coming from the hypothalamus or not, a good thing to key in on first thing, unless you recognize the name itself, look for this releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone kind of nomenclature, because we can see that it shows up over and over again. So here we can see thyroid releasing hormone is our hypothalamic tropic hormone, eventually affecting our thyroid gland. we can see our corticotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Eventually, when we get to the end of this domino cascade, it'll be releasing cortisol, but the corticotropin releasing hormone is the part coming from the hypothalamus. Here we have growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, ultimately affecting very many different kinds of growth, as well as the liver. Here we have our gonadotropin releasing hormone affecting a bunch of sections that we'll see later on. So these are all the different kinds of flows that we're going to be going through. We're going to particularly be focusing on some of these, especially over the rest of the unit. So we're going to spend some time with the thyroid, thinking about this pathway from the thyroid releasing hormone to the actual thyroid hormones themselves. We'll be thinking about the stress response and cortisol. So we're going to be highlighting this one. Okay. And when we get to A&P2, we're going to focus in on this one over here at the right, the hormones that affect the gonad. That'll come more in a later unit. So you should be familiar with these if I describe hormones to you, but these are going to be your most two important ones to spend your most time on and kind of study the thyroid hormone and the cortisol releasing. So prioritization. All right. So looking at that diagram, I want to make sure that we know how to read it. We can practice reading it, follow reading it, and know how to recognize what's going on. So looking at that picture that we had on the previous slide, I want you to take a look and let me know what happens when our growth hormone releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. Take another couple seconds to pick an answer choice and we'll talk it through. All right. So yeah, so when we release our growth hormone releasing hormone, right? So the GHRH, that's our hypothalamic pituitary, our hypothalamic tropic hormone that it's then going to, first things first, send its hormone to the anterior pituitary. Okay. So when we get to the anterior pituitary, we release some of this growth hormone regulating hormone. We're just going to be affecting the release of the specific anterior pituitary hormone related to that initial stimulus, that initial hypothalamic hormone. So growth hormone releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone specifically. That's why it's called that. Right? So the naming convention there is actually really straightforward. So hopefully predictable which one's from the hypothalamus, which one's from the anterior pituitary. So then we release that growth hormone, going to cells out in the body and also to the liver. So that was something we could read kind of down that map on the previous slide. Right, so we were reading down the line right here. So we were going growth hormone releasing hormone to endocrine cells in this peach part is the anterior pituitary. Right, so specifically those endocrine cells are releasing growth hormone. And then we're going to the liver and we're going generally to cells everywhere throughout the body. All right. We're gonna kind of step through some of our glands. We're gonna go kind of head to toe as we walk through our primary endocrine organs before we focus in on a couple topics within the endocrine system. So another structure in the brain that we would want to know about related to the endocrine system is the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is right here at the back. I don't think it was on your lab list, but you may or may not have tried to take a peek between the cerebellum and cerebrum to sneak a peek at that one right there. So this is some glandular tissue directly in the brain. It secretes the hormone melatonin. You've probably heard of melatonin before because they sell it over the counter all the time. So people take it when they're having trouble sleeping or suffering from jet lag, things like that, because melatonin is thought to be involved with our sort of like light dark cycles, our perception of light, and therefore linked up to our circadian rhythms, linked up to our sleeping patterns. So we think it's potentially kind of part of this signal telling us it's time to sleep. Some humans may be involved in circadian rhythms, whether taking melatonin actually works for you or not, kind of up to you. Some studies say yes, some studies say no. Okay. But definitely in other species, we know that it's related to some other systems that have to do with sensing light and dark, sensing kind of time using light. So there are a lot of seasonal processes in other mammals, like hibernating and stuff, that rely on being able to sense kind of these shifts to light patterns. That's the job of the pineal gland. So next, we're going to be stepping down into the neck. So the thyroid hormones are one of the hormone pathways we're going to want to think about a little more extensively. So let's take a look at our thyroid. So our thyroid gland sits in your neck. Here we can see your larynx, which is your voice box. So you can kind of feel that on yourself. That's your Adam's apple more colloquially, like that's the larynx, and your thyroid cartilage. So your thyroid gland is going to be just a bit lower. So here we see that glandular tissue a little lower before we go into the trachea, which is the tube that leads into your lungs. Okay, so it's kind of sitting there on the trachea, right where it's joining into the voice box. So we have two hormones that are coming from the thyroid. So we do refer to them both as thyroid hormones. So I am generally going to refer to them as T4 and T3. What that actually stands for is tetra, so that's the 4 part, iodothyronine. So the thyrine is coming from the thyroid part. This iodo part tells you that it has some stuff to do with iodine. So iodine is going to be important for production of these thyroid hormones. So T3 is triiodothyronine. Okay, so a thyroid hormone involved with iodine as well, but slightly different structure here. So the more abundant of these two hormones is the T4. So that's about 90% of the thyroid hormone that you release. About 10% is the T3 form, but that's the one that actually is a bit more active at the tissues that the thyroid hormones are targeting. So it's kind of like more effective. The general role of our thyroid hormones is to regulate metabolism. We'll see a number of hormones are involved with like food processing and metabolism, but our thyroid hormones are kind of the first one that we're getting to as we do this little walk through the head and neck. Another effect in general, kind of in this region, is we release a hormone called calcitonin, helps regulate calcium levels in the blood, which is also kind of the job of the parathyroid glands, which we'll see in a bit. Let's focus in on those thyroid hormones. So if you look inside the thyroid gland, inside all those little lumps that we see on that glandular tissue, we see that the structure of the thyroid gland involves some blood flow. So we have blood flow going past through the thyroid gland. So here's our blood. Okay. Then we have these outer cells called follicular cells. So follicular cells are kind of like the skin of the thyroid gland. Right, so our follicular cells are here. Right, so those are the ones in kind of brownish color. And then they're surrounding a region called the colloid. So here we see the colloid in the center of our thyroid gland. Okay, so those are three kind of like places that we want to think about if we're trying to understand what's going on. Okay, so when we think about their production, okay, we're going to start by thinking about the center kind of mass of jelly here in the center is our colloid. And we can see that in the colloid, that's where we store our important precursor molecule. So this molecule, thyroglobulin, is stored in the colloid. It's not a thyroid hormone itself, but it's going to let us make our different thyroid hormones. Okay. So in order to ultimately make our thyroid hormones, we're going to need to grab iodine, and we're going to need to pull iodine into the colloid. We tack it onto that thyroid globulin in a bunch of places. So these are kind of where we're putting our iodine pieces here onto the thyroid globulin. Okay. And that gives us ultimately the molecule set up to give us both T3 and T4. So both of our two thyroid hormones, we've set up the initial parts of their structure here in the colloid. But they're still connected together. They're not separate. They're not individually their own hormones yet. Okay. So that's what we do in the colloid. Now, if we're going to release thyroid hormone, that means we need a signal, right? So before we actually break all that stuff in the colloid up and send it out into the bloodstream, we're waiting for a signal. Okay. So we can see that the signal has to come from outside the thyroid gland. So here is our thyroid stimulating hormone coming from the anterior pituitary. Right, so this is coming from the anterior pituitary and would count as a trophic hormone because it's going to be affecting the release of our thyroid hormones, which are hormones. Okay. So we're waiting for this TSH coming through the blood into this capillary bed, where it's going to come into contact with a receptor. So here we see a receptor for TSH on this follicular cell, and that's our signal. It's time to release thyroid hormones. Okay. So in response, we can see that we then break up the structure that we made in the colloid. Oh. Okay. So here we can see that we broke up our T3 and T4. And so you can see them hanging out in the vesicle. Ultimately, a lysozyme breaks them up, and we get them into the bloodstream at the end of this pathway. We're waiting for our TSH to come down the bloodstream. When we get it, we break up that T3 and T4 that we started making in the colloid using some of our iodine that we're eating, put it into the bloodstream. We have a little bit of T3 and T4 here already. When we get to target tissue, there's some conversion of T4 back into T3 as well. We can see that there's negative feedback on this too. So you don't want to always be secreting more and more and more thyroid hormone. We want to keep that kind of stable. So when we're releasing these molecules, we also have a pathway of negative feedback coming from that T4 secretion. So once we see a lot of T4 in the blood, right? So we see a lot of T4 in the blood, it's going to loop back up both to the anterior pituitary, which was that kind of direct little piece of signaling. So that TSH coming from the anterior pituitary. And we have long loop feedback all the way back to the hypothalamus. So that thyroid releasing hormone secretion was coming from the hypothalamus. So we're turning off both these signals as we see higher and higher levels of T4. That's our general pathway here for our thyroid. Questions about it? So when we're thinking about how these hormones ultimately behave in your body, instead of being protein-based hormones, we saw before that we had some peptide hormones coming from the posterior pituitary. Our thyroid hormones are lipophilic, so they like lipids. This is a sort of lipid-involved system. So steroids are another example of lipids, right? So we've been talking about phospholipids and some triglycerides in the past. This is the time to remember that cholesterol is a lipid, steroids are lipids, there are other types of lipids. And what the thyroid hormones ultimately do is they change some transcription of mRNA. So our RNA is telling us what proteins to build, which means that they are going to affect what proteins your cell has in it. Specifically, these are going to be a bunch of hormones and proteins that ultimately kind of control metabolism a bit, right? So we're going to be controlling production of ATP a little bit here. So lacking thyroid hormone would be a problem. So an example of a disease that affects this thyroid pathway is congenital hypothyroidism or cretinism. And so this happens when you don't have enough of these hormones available during development. That can cause birth defects of various sorts. This is also something that they might test for if you go to the clinic and you're really lethargic, really tired, maybe having issues with weight. Might have to do with issues with this hormone that affects metabolism and therefore affects energy balance. So before we go to this next little slide, thinking about some of the specifics of those effects, want to touch back on some vocabulary that we briefly mentioned in our first unit, because this unit, this endocrine stuff, is where we're going to really tap into this in more detail. So one of the many G words that we saw at the very end of our metabolism section was glycogenolysis. I want to try and remember what that meant. Okay, let's take a peek. Those came in fast. That's great. Okay. Yeah. So glycogenolysis means breaking down glycogen, right? So here's that lysis part. Lysis always means you're breaking something down. Okay. And here we can see that what we're breaking down is the glycogen. Okay. So we're breaking down glycogen in order to get the little glucose subunits out of glycogen and eventually use them for energy. So we did have words for all these other things too. We can make glycogen, we can break down glucose, we can make new glucose, and that's going to be glycogen synthesis, glycolysis, we have gluconeogenesis. So when you see a bunch of G words in this unit, make sure you read the whole word carefully. Don't let your eyes bleed. So, asking you about that because two of our G words are going to appear here on this slide about thyroid hormones. We refer to thyroid hormones in general as having a calorogenic effect. Okay. So what we're really talking about, okay, is what we're doing with these thyroid hormones is we're increasing a bunch of stuff related to metabolism, right? So we're going to make newer and bigger mitochondria. We're going to make a bunch of enzymes related to oxidative phosphorylation. So we saw that at the end of our electron transport chain, one of our ways of making ATP. All right, so we're getting ready to make more ATP. We're going to be breaking down more things. So we're going to break down glycogen, right? So that glycogenolysis, breaking down glycogen, getting those glucose subunits out. We're also breaking down proteins, right? So we got two more lysis words here. So proteolysis, breaking down proteins, lipolysis, breaking down lipids, okay? So breaking these things down generally means that we're breaking them down to make energy. We're also going to make some new glucose, right? So some new glucose as well as some ketones. And we're going to be making some beta adrenergic receptors. So we're making some of these receptors that were targets of our sympathetic nervous system, which is like our fight or flight part of the nervous system, our kind of energy and movement related part of our autonomic nervous system. That's our calorogenic effect here with the thyroid hormones. And to fuel the action of cells doing all sorts of things in general, we're also speeding up our sodium-potassium pump, which we know sets up gradients of sodium and potassium so that we can use them basically to power all sorts of signaling in the cells as we use that sodium gradient for electrical signaling in neurons. And we also are going to see that sodium and potassium can do some secondary active transport. We've seen secondary active transport with sodium. So to our next slide. That's our story about thyroid hormones. So we're now continuing our walk through our glands. So our next gland is the parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid glands, there are actually 4 of them. And if you're looking for them, they're kind of hard to find if you're in the lab because they're just 4 little clumps that sit on the back of your thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is this pink bubblegum stuff, and the parathyroid glands are here on the back of the thyroid glands, and our parathyroid hormone coming from those parathyroid glands. Its main job is to regulate calcium levels. And we'll see it when we get into muscles and the heart, that calcium levels are important because they're going to be related to muscular signaling. And we already know that calcium is important for our neurotransmitters and our release of various neurotransmitters, because we know that that calcium gradient is going to lead to calcium flowing into cells when the action potential gets there, triggering that release of neurotransmitters. So we want to make sure we've got the right calcium level. Okay. So our next bit, we're going to be thinking about glucocorticoids. We're kind of staying on this metabolism track here. So I'm going to take a peek back at the adrenal gland. We're going to take a bit of a more detailed look right now than we did before. So we saw the adrenal gland before when we were thinking about one of those 3 pathways for the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Right, so we had the sympathetics going to chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla, the medulla. So the central cavity here was where we had some of our sympathetic structures. Now that we're talking about the endocrine system, we're actually going to be talking about the shell of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal cortex out here, so think like the orange peel of the adrenal gland, is where we have our adrenocorticoids coming from. And here we have our little adrenal gland sitting on top of a kidney. Okay, so that's what it would look like if you were to see it in your body. Okay. So we have a couple different types of adrenocorticoids that come from the adrenal cortex, right? So adreno for adrenal gland, corticoids, right? There's that cortex in the word here, right? So you see this word in blank out, it says where it's coming from in the name. Right? So we're going to have our mineralocorticoids specifically aldosterone. So it's going to regulate things like minerals, sort of. It's going to regulate sodium and potassium. And it's going to be important when we think about kidneys and all the stuff they're doing to affect your water balance and your electrolyte balance in your blood. So aldosterone will come back, that mineralocorticoid in A&P2. Okay. What we're going to focus on in this unit are our glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol. So cortisol is helping regulate how your body responds to stressors. Okay, so this is going to be part of a general stress response as it goes towards target tissue. And as we are regulating our response to stress, we're also going to have some more effects on metabolism. So we had our thyroid gland affecting metabolism. Cortisol is also going to affect metabolism. And it happens to be the case that some sex hormones are also coming from the adrenal cortex. So androgens, the things that like ultimately lead to testosterone, some of them come from the adrenal gland. So actually everybody has levels of testosterone in their blood because everybody has adrenal glands. That's where they're coming from, and they're part of regulating the reproductive system. So that verbal reminder that we've seen the adrenal medulla before, we've seen the adrenal gland before. Remember that we had modified postganglionic cells, turned them into these little guys called chromatin cells, which mainly release epinephrine. So when we see epinephrine related to our adrenergic receptors, that's where that epinephrine is coming from. They release some norepinephrine because they're modified postganglionic sympathetic cells, and a teensy tiny bit of dopamine. So they were under direct neural control, right? So they were part of the nervous system essentially. Versus when we look at the adrenal cortex, we're thinking about stuff that's under hormonal control in this kind of flow of tropic hormones. Okay. So when we think about how we get to our release of cortisol, okay, so cortisol is our glucocorticoid that we're dialing in on here, coming from the adrenal cortex, so it's kind of stress hormone. And we're going to start up in the brain where we're sensing signals. Right? So we're sensing some stressful situation, right? Some stressful kind of trigger, be it physical, mental, whatever. Okay? That's part of what's going to be starting this pathway off. Your circadian rhythm also plays a role here. So cortisol is partially supposed to be helping you regulate when you get tired and when you wake up, right? Like you can kind of think of waking up as being like a little burst of stress in a kind of sideways way. So circadian rhythm also affects our secretion of corticotropin releasing hormone. So here we have this corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So up in the brain, that's our first step. So we'd be going into that first of two capillary beds. Our first capillary bed through our portal vein, down into a second capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. This is where we're going to be releasing our next tropic hormone, ACTH. So this is adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So it's also a tropic hormone because it's going to go to a third hormone, its release. So that's the one coming from the anterior pituitary gland. And that signal is going all the way to the adrenal cortex, telling your adrenal cortex to release this cortisol that then should be going back and turning off these two earlier signals. So we hopefully don't have runaway constant cortisol secretion, right? We don't want this to be in a constant positive feedback loop. We do want to turn this off at the end. Okay. So this is our pathway for when we release our cortisol secretion in response to circadian rhythm stress. Okay. And when we think about the actions here of glucocorticoids, and specifically when we're focusing in on cortisol, we're thinking about this as a hormone of stress. So it's regulated via an axis that is named based on those two earlier tropic hormones in the pathway. So it's the CRH-ACTH axis, That's just naming first our hypothalamic hormone and then our anterior pituitary hormone that ultimately lead to cortisol release. Okay. So its job is partially going to be to mobilize energy stores. Right? So we're going to be getting any energy that we've stored in the body, getting ready to break that down into ATP. That also has the effect of suppressing the immune response while it does this. It's kind of a side effect here of how it's acting. So when we think about cortisol and the stress response, we'll think about something called general adaptation system, or sorry, yeah, general adaptation syndrome. This is like a stereotypical kind of pathway that happens when we see stress in the body. When you're stressed out, a bunch of things are happening at once. So one of those things that happen when you're stressed out is you increase your cortisol secretion. When you're in the stress situation, you're also increasing sympathetic activity. Right? That's our fight or flight part, right? So that's another effect happening in response to stress. You're also releasing epinephrine, which is synonymous with adrenaline from the adrenal medulla, also part of our stress. There are even some other hormones we'd be releasing. So ADH from the posterior pituitary is also involved in stress here. So is something called angiotensin 2. Our overall kind of action of all of these is to mobilize energy stores to make ATP. Right? So we're like breaking everything down that we can for energy. Right? We want to make ATP. And these later two ones that I'm not focusing in on right now, not focusing in on because they come in more in A&P2, but they're helping you maintain blood pressure. Blood pressure being important because you want to pump a lot of blood to your muscles so you can get them oxygen, get them this energy that you're making. You want to keep blood flow to your brain. So this is an overall stress response that involves multiple parts of your body. Okay, so I'll pick up here next time. And everybody have a good week.